Hello friends, nice to meet you back in Cloud Pedagogy. So in this lesson, we are going to start using Git commands to work with our AWS CodeCommit repositories. So we are going to be cloning repositories, doing commits and pushes to the repository and pulls from the repository. We'll also verify that everything we have done previously in our setup has worked properly. So setting up Git, setting up users, and probably most importantly setting them up to be able to SSH into our EC2 instance. So let's take a look at our diagram, and initially we are going to need to clone the main repository. We'll do that with Resh, and Resh starts changing the files and committing them in local, pushing back to the main repository. Finally, Kins pulls the repository so that she can be up to date with the main repository. So let's see prerequisites before doing this lab. Please finish the mentioned labs here that are needed before attempting this. So first let me connect to SSH with Resh and Kins credentials and configure them with Git and CodeCommit credentials. As you can see, we have already configured them in previous labs. I have already configured AWS credentials for both accounts here. So if you are ready to improve your DevOps skills, let's jump into our task. In task 1, we are going to clone a repository. In task 2, we'll see how to commit the files into the repository. In task 3, we'll push the files into the repository, and then in task 4, we are going to pull the same from the repository. So these are really the core Git commands that we'll be using to work with our repositories. So let's start with the task 1, clone a repository. The first thing we are going to do is SSH into our EC2 instance, which is housing our repositories, and we'll first do that with as Resh. So the command is ssh-i, there is our key pair, and we can now log in as Resh because of the SSH keygen process we went through previously. So let's do that. Alright, we are now logged in as Resh. We are going to do a lot here. Now the first thing we want to do is clone the main repository. Also, I have configured AWS account with Resh. So let's say Resh has joined to the team newly and comes on to the work on a Monday morning, and she wants to begin working. She has tasks, she has assignments, and she wants to begin working with the student app repository. So what Resh will do is a process called cloning. Clone is primarily used to point to an existing repo and make a clone or copy of that repo into a new directory, maybe at another location wherever you prefer. So Resh can clone that repository and create her own local repository, and this is going to allow her to work on this repository independently without affecting our central repository. It's also going to verify credentials and set up that handshaking that's going to go on between the central repository. So Resh knows that she needs to clone. But what? What does she need to clone? Well, just in case she doesn't know, she can list the repository as we have seen previously, either from the console or from the CLI. Let's see in the console first. Yes, I can see student app repository with a list of files. Now check in the CLI. You will enter AWS CodeCommit list repositories. What repository does she want? The repository she is going to work with this is student app repository. Alright, so we are working with HTTPS. So just go to the repository in the console page. Here is our clone URL, clone HTTPS, and we are going to be working a ton from the CLI. So I just want to show some of the capabilities in the management console as well. So let's copy that to our clipboard and then say git clone URL and give a local folder name. So our command becomes a git clone or HTTPS URL for our repo. Paste that in, and then just the space, and what Resh needs to do is give her local version of this repo a name, and she'll call it local student app dev. Of course, it doesn't take a long time because it's not a big repo. There it goes, all done. How do we know? Let's do an ls. As you can see, there is our new repository. Alright, so Resh has cloned the repository. Good job. Now you know how to clone a repository to your local system. In the task 2, we will see how to commit the files that are changed. So let's say that Resh's task is a feature change. Having cloned to the central repository, Resh can work on that feature change independently. And when she completed, she can perform a commit. The commit is used to save your changes within the local repository. Now, the thing is to understand with these commits, remember this commit remains local. So, Resh is going to make changes to the code and she is going to do commits, but it remains local until she does a push to the main repository. And that's very important to understand. So, Resh creates a file with a touch command. So, go into the folder and create a file. And I'll say edit the file, vi file name, enter something inside the file, and then she can just test it. Let's change the permissions of the file. There we go. Now she wants to do a commit, and it's simply git commit -m, and then you can add a command. Before that, we have couple other commands to go with that. So one of those command is git status, and this is telling us that we have an untracked file. This file is just kind of hanging on Resh's local machine, but we can add this to our commit with git add. We will be able to see a commit and then push that commit to the central repository. Enter git add file name. So let's do that. Okay, and just to be clear, the git add is operating right here. It added that file to Resh's local commit. This hasn't gone anywhere yet. This hasn't gone to the central repository. That's where the git commit comes into play. What we can do is we can just keep adding new files that we create to our commit locally. Now we could also be working with our testers and maybe have somebody test that for us before we push to the central repository. Let's git status again. Notice that it's changed a little bit from untracked files. Well, this file is essentially tracked now. We add it to our commit and changes to be committed. Now what if Resh made a mistake here? So the code has changed and now we have version 2. Now we just don't want to throw this version 2 over the fence and put it into the production, right? There is going to be some testing done here, and this is where QA comes into play in real time. Let's say she encountered some errors and she wants to remove this file from her commit. So she would do git rm with an option of cached with the file name. Let's take a look at git status again, and we are back to this file being untracked. The rm is not deleting that file, it's simply removing it from the commit. Let's say Resh really wants to add that to her commit, so we will just put it back with git add. Alright, so Resh just wanted that one file she is ready to commit. So it's just git commit and then add a comment for it. Of course, Resh needs to provide a little bit more information. So that commit is not yet finalized. Git wants us to run these commands, doesn't know who Resh is. So there is one with her email and username. Let's try that again. I'm entering git with username and email. Let's try it again. The commit, there we go. So our commit is finalized. Understand though, this is still on Resh's local repository. It's not yet in the main repository. The main repository is still at version 1 while version 2 is sitting on Resh's local machine. Good work. Now you know how to commit the files which are changed in your local. Now you probably can guess what needs to happen next. That is the task 3. We need to know how to push these files to the repository. Resh needs to do a push, git push, remote name and the branch name. We'll talk about that momentarily. So with our git push, we need a remote name and a branch name. Let's do a git remote. And that is the origin. That is where the commit is coming from. That's where we are pushing from. If you do not get any output for this command, maybe you need to set that with git remote add with the CodeCommit clone URL. What about git branch main? We'll just enter git branch and that is where we are pushing to. So the remote name is the nickname the local repo uses for the central repository origin. And then the name of the branch is the branch that you want to push to. We want to push to the main. But what is git diff stats? Well, let's check it out. So we do git diff stat origin or main, and that essentially is going to tell us what we are pushing. And of course, we only have one file to push. So we are ready to push. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm entering git push origin main, and it is git push origin node space rather than the /main. So we are pushing Resh's commit to the central repository. Let's do it. There we go. So our push has completed. Now let's just go use the console, and we should have cp test.py file here. So let's just refresh. There it is with a little bonus learning here. Let's go back. Let's verify our commits as well. Let me click commit here in the left navigation bar. There you can see the first commit was done by Cloud Pedagogy and the next commit was done by Resh. Good job. So Resh did a clone and then she did some work locally, created a commit, pushed it to the central repository. So Resh is on version 2 and our main repository is also on version 2. In the task 4, we are going to pull the repository. Now that's great for Resh, but now the rest of our team needs to get in sync with what's going on at the central repository. For instance, Kins comes to work on Tuesday and let's say Kins has already cloned the repository a day before to Resh's commit. She already has a version 1 down at her local repository, but there is now version 2 in central repository. Now Kins will then be out of sync with the central repository. She does not yet have the updates and that can be verified just with an ls. There will be no cp test.py file there. So of course Kins wants to do this pull and that's going to pull everything from the central repository since Kins last sync, and of course her last sync was the clone of version 1. So she needs version 2 and essentially that is just cp test.py file. And she will have to do is pull from the central repository to get what we will call version 2. Now we know what's going to come up here, but let's do it anyway. Let's do a git remote origin and git branch will give us main. So the pull command is simply git pull origin main. Alright, that pull pulled our one file down to Kins local repository. She is now on version 2. Everybody is in sync. And remember, here is our all important HTTPS URL where to pull from the main repository. This is good. We know it worked. We can just do an ls and we will see our cp-test.py file has been added in Kins local repository. Now the question is it executable? Well, let's just find out without doing the chmod. I'll enter ls-la. The answer is yes. That file was pulled down and retained the permissions that Resh assigned to it. Good work. Now you know how to pull the repository to keep yourself up to date with all the changes done by the team. Great. According to our lab diagram, so just some key takeaways from this whole process. Imagine that a new developer Rohi has joined into the team. The first thing she has to do is clone that repository. Of course, now Rohi knows how to do that, isn't it? So everyone is in sync. Everyone is on version 2. Resh, Kins and Rohi and even our central repo all on version 2, and really these are the core commands to work with our CodeCommit repository. Congratulations! We cloned, did some work locally and did a commit. Remember, the commit remains local until we do a push. And then our other developer, in this case just Kins, needs to get up to date at some point by doing a pull. So those are the core commands. If you really understand this session, you will go a long way in understanding how to work with CodeCommit. You may make your mistakes and it's not going to hurt anybody, isn't it? What's the best way to learn? Well, I tend to think learning from our mistakes is the best way to learn as long as we learn and don't keep repeating the same mistakes. Now complications arise and we'll talk about that in our next lesson. So please join me in the next lesson. Until then, keep learning and have fun.